The meeting today is Marxism versus Post-Marxism, and the speaker is Tomáš Tengely-Evans. Tomáš is a member of the Socialist Workers' Party and is in the national leadership. Without further ado, Tomáš.
Can you all hear me with this mic? Yeah? Terrific. Well, I want to start this meeting on Marxism versus post-Marxism by thinking about the political context that we're in. And the first thing I want to say is that we are living through an age of catastrophes where crisis appears to be the new normal within the system. You have the ever-present potential for military catastrophe, sort of hammering home with the kind of inter-imperialist rivalries that are taking place in the world system, the United States and Russia and China. You have the economic catastrophe, both the potential for global slump, but also the cost of living crisis that's, and social emergency that's hammering working class people. But added on top of that, you have climate chaos and the existence of life on the planet in any sort of sustainable way. And then I think in the last few years also questions of oppression and how systematic that is have come to the fore. And I think that's the sort of questions that I want to address in the meeting on Marxism versus post-Marxism. First of all, the question is one of totality. Can we explain these different crises through saying that they're rooted within the capitalist system, within how capitalism is organized, or do they in fact have diffuse roots? Are they discrete, separate and unconnected in some way? And the second question then is the problem of agency. If we are faced with this world of crisis, is there a unified subject that is able to actually change society and construct it along different lines? And if there is one, what is it and what would it take for us to have those sort of changes? And I think Marxism and post-Marxism offer different both sorts of analyses about how to understand the world, and also point to different strategies in terms of uprooting the system. I want to start by just outlining what I think Marxism is, because if we're going to talk about post-Marxism, it's quite a varied field with many different thinkers, but I think it presents various challenges to what I would call classical Marxism. So I want to begin by thinking about what that is. And for me, the core of Marxism is that it is the theory and practice of working class self-emancipation. In other words, that working class people are not going to build a different sort of socialist society by looking towards a left government or the state or the changes coming through above. It has to be a process of the working class through its own struggles, trying to take on the present system, and then through its own democratic organizations, building a different sort of society run from the bottom up. And through this process of struggle, the working class can not only get rid of the capitalist class and free itself, can also begin to uproot oppression and win liberation and emancipation more broadly within society. What do I mean by the working class? And I think this is quite an important question in this meeting, and it's one of the central challenges that post-Marxism presents. First of all, class, if you look at any kind of mainstream analysis, is often presented as a sort of a thing, with various attributes. You're middle class if you do X, Y, and Z. You have these sort of cultural tastes and so on. You're working class if you have these sort of cultural tastes and you work in these sort of occupations and so on. For us, though, from Marxist understanding, class is fundamentally a social relationship, and class arises out of what Marx called the relations of production. And I'm going through this because it's going to matter later on, it'll become apparent. And what are the relations of production within capitalism? Fundamentally, it's about an antagonistic relationship of exploitation between a minority of capitalists and a majority of workers. And by workers, I don't just mean the stereotypical image of the workers going into the factory. Anyone who is forced to sell their labor power for a wage is working class. And then also it's a question about control and or ownership of the means of production, whether that's call centers, factories, and so on. Thinking of the stuff that we need to make other stuff, goods and services. And under capitalism, the capitalist class own or control the means of production. The working class does not. And it's also then divisions within the capitalist class itself between rival capitalist firms and capitalist states, which drive forward this system of exploitation. And what does this mean for Marxism? A couple of things. First of all, that the working class is a special class, that there's an interdependence between capital and labor, that the capitalists rely on the working class to pump out profits, their profits. So in other words, being working class and the process of exploitation imbues working class people with a power that, say, the experience of oppression does not. Think about the recent strike waves that we've seen. When the rail workers went on strike, they were able to bring large parts of the network grinding to a halt. This gives, the fact of exploitation gives workers that sort of power, and this means that they would be able to, potentially through their collective struggles, abolish class society and also bring about a new order, not based on exploiting other classes, but actually bring about a classless society. The working class is a collective class for Marxists. In other words, think about capitalism, it brings together working class people through urbanization, but also in large workplaces. And I'll talk about some of the changes in capitalism later on. But actually, the stability of relatively large workplaces is quite remarkable. It's not true that we're all, bogus, self-employed, precarious, and so on, the way it's sometimes presented in the mainstream. And this means that the working class is a collective class. In other words, to be a bit crude about it, imagine I were a peasant. I could rise up, take over my plot of land, and so on, and till that land by myself. You can't do that if you take over a capitalist workplace. It forces you have to cooperate in order to run it democratically from the bottom up. So there's a tendency for working class people also in struggle to experiment with different forms of self-organization from below a collective class. And the last thing I'll just say about this is that also what there tends to be is a kind of homogeneity relative to capital. Now, that doesn't mean that every working class person's experiences of the workplace are the same, but they have a basic common situation of exploitation and by a common enemy, the capitalist class. And therefore, through that process, through their position within the relations of production, they have a common set of objective class interests. Doesn't mean that they always have the consciousness that this is what's taking place, that we need to get rid of capitalism and so on, but there's an objective basis within that. So the working class is both an object of exploitation, and also a potential subject in terms of getting rid of that system, and can come to feel its power through the process of struggle. And that's, for the SWP, our vision of socialism is one of working class people through their own democratic organizations running society from the bottom up. Now, what is post-Marxism? Post-Marxism refers to a variety of different things, but I think it's a big challenge to what I've just said in many different forms. The idea that the working class is able to emancipate itself and also the rest of society through a socialist revolution. And I'll look at some concrete examples of what that means. Now, in a strict kind of narrow sense, post-Marxism, the term comes from Leclau and Mouffe in Hegemony and Socialist Strategy, where they say it is no longer possible to maintain the conception of subjectivity in classes elaborated by Marxism, what I've just been talking about, nor its historical vision of the historical course of capitalist development, nor of the conception of communism as a transparent society. That's a kind of narrow, kind of what it means in a narrow sense, and that's where it comes from. But it refers to a much broader set, I think, of ideas which I want to go through. First of all, when we think of different post-Marxist thinkers, there is a skepticism towards grand narratives or meta-narratives, as we sometimes refer to them. In other words, the idea that Marxism, as a theory, provides a comprehensive theory of historical development and sees capitalism as sort of the latest iteration of an exploitative society and can explain that. that would count as a sort of a grand narrative. There's a sort of skepticism towards those. There's the rejection of the working class as the force that can liberate society. And I'll talk about this a bit more, quite a lot more actually, as the talk goes on. And these are kind of the two of the main things, but I think there's all sorts of others attached to it. The idea that Marxism is in some ways reductionist and deterministic. All Marxists are interested in is the economy. And this is a very crude way of looking at the world. You need to understand other, political forces, social forces, other terrains of struggle. Now, of course, there are versions of Marxism which are incredibly crude and deterministic. The sort of Marxism that dominated, well, first of all, the Second International, the group of socialist parties in the late 19th, early 20th century, that was incredibly deterministic. The idea that socialism was, was the march towards it was in some way inevitable. People like the Czech Marxist Karl Kautsky and so on. The politics of things like the French Communist Party or the Italian Communist Party in the post-war period, the sort of Stalinism, was incredibly deterministic and economistic in that way. But that's not actually what I would call is kind of the classical Marxist approach. But nonetheless, in many ways, post-Marxism was critiquing a certain sort of Marxism that was dominant, which came from the dominance of the communist parties and so on. There's a rejection of, or skepticism to, the idea that the working class has objective interess in the way that I described. Now, there's some moves away from that in some bits of post-Marxism. There's a book out recently by Jeremy Gilbert, and I forget the other chap's name, who says that we need to go back to talking about interests. I think there's still weaknesses in the way they talk about it, quite individualized and so on. But nonetheless, skepticism towards the idea that you have an objective set of class interests arising out of the relations of production. Class is seen as one of many isms. So rather than class giving people a power to actually fight back against the system in the way that the process of discrimination and so on through oppression doesn't, there's a rejection of that. The kind of dominant way that people talk about classism often, as if class is just another sort of way that people are discriminated against, a rejection of a revolutionary organization. And also, I think, often this is based on, what I'm going to disagree with, but based on the idea that there have been fundamental changes in how capitalism operates. So if you think about one of the thinkers I'm going to go on to consider, Tony Negri, in one of his more recent works at the time of the Egyptian Revolution, Occupy and so on, said that essentially capitalism, or presents capital as a sort of parasitic substance that, and he says that exists from the extraction of rent rather than profit. Through kind of financial instruments and so on. Now, that's not true, by the way. That's not how capitalism works today. And I'll go through why. But it's this idea that, okay, capitalism is no longer based primarily on pumping profit out of the working class, and therefore you can't really talk about the working class changing society in that way. I think there's quite obviously a lot of different kind of thinkers within this. I'm not going to cover all of them. So if people are upset that why didn't you mention so-and-so, I think that's fairly inevitable. But I'm going to try and look at the kind of the broad ideas, but also then at some practical examples about how people can confront this. Because I think by and large, people don't go around saying, I'm a post-Marxist. It's not really a kind of a popular label. But I think it's outside of academia, perhaps. But it's a sort of set of ideas that filters down into a sort of common sense that many activists have within the movement. And I'll look at some of them. Just want to say that when it comes to post-Marxism, I said it was a challenge to those Marxist ideas. Now, by that I don't mean that in the SWP we think nothing valuable can be added to what Marx said. This is what was written in 1869. That's the end of the argument. I mean, there are some people like that on the left. I remember reading a Marxist critique of queer theory by one group, and they said, well, this is what Lenin said in Empirical Criticism, and therefore that's that argument dealt with. Well, it's a bit more complicated than that. I've just been involved in producing a pamphlet on trans and non-binary oppression for the SWP as part of the LGBT plus caucus. Guess what? Marx didn't talk about that. But we can still use a Marxist method to analyze these kind of new things that come up. Imperialism, Marx did talk about, colonization and so on, but it took Lenin, Rosa Luxemburg, Bukharin and other Marxists to actually confront a concrete situation in the beginning of the 20th century. So this is not about, Marxism is not a dogma for us, but it's what I want to argue is that it provides the conceptual tools and a method for analyzing society, and that we don't require going beyond kind of those kind of methods, but we can use those to analyze the very real problems that we face. Okay, in general terms, where does it come from? I think it's sort of various ideas, post-Marxism, post-structuralism, postmodernism, and so on, come out of what one could call the disillusioned children of 1968. 1968, that great year of revolts, and as those revolts don't break through into full, they shake the system and so on, but nonetheless they don't win in terms of overturning that system. And the sort of Marxism that dominates is both of the old communist parties, but also different forms of kind of Marxism, say, look to Mao's China and other places, that aren't based on the idea of working class self-emancipation. And there's a general feeling afterwards amongst certainly left intellectuals that really, this idea of trying for a social transformation is not really going to work as a result of the disillusionment that comes out of 68. Lyotard, French philosopher, says, there's no question here of proposing a pure alternative to the system. We all know now, as the 1970s came to a close, that an attempt at an alternative of that kind would end up resembling the system it was meant to replace. And he was referring to the Soviet Union. Now, we in the SWP don't look towards the Soviet Union as a sort of socialist alternative, but many people did or had illusions in it. And therefore, the idea that, well, you can't really, let's not try and change society because it's going to end up quite badly. And goes on to say that postmodernism is this kind of a rejection of meta-narratives. Marxism very much being one of those kind of meta or grand narratives. By the way, I'm not going to read out everything that's on the PowerPoint presentation. People can kind of read that themselves. I'm going to talk around it if that's okay. So there's this sort of disillusion that comes out of 68 and a move away from and rejection of classical Marxism. This is often post-Marxist ideas are developed in a dialogue with post-structuralism. I'm not going to spend too much time on post-structuralism. Maybe people will be glad about that. Some people will not. But essentially, what I'll say is that one can have, sort of, broadly speaking, two forms of post-structuralism. One is generally referred to as a sort of textualism, associated with people like Derrida and so on, which looks at purely kind of discursive sort of questions, and then another sort of post-structuralism associated with Michel Foucault, Gilles Deleuze, Felix Guattari, and so on. And they want to focus on both the said and the unsaid, not just discursive questions. And I think what should we take from this in a sort of nutshell is that Foucault talks about, it seems to me that power is almost there and that no one is ever outside of it. In other words, not that doesn't see power within society arising out of that kind of out of the base, out of those social relations of capitalism. Rather, it almost seems sort of inescapable. And he talks of a concept, the dispositif, where many, which refers to the many sort of institutional, physical, and knowledge structures that maintain and exercise power within society. Deleuze and Guattari talk about the assemblage, which is a very slippery concept, again, an eclectic one, but nonetheless, it's this idea that really power is everywhere. And as a result of that, if power is kind of everywhere, Foucault writes, points of resistance are present everywhere in the power network. Hence, there is no single locus of great refusal, no soul of revolt, source of all rebellions, or pure law of the revolutionary. Instead, there is a plurality of resistances, each of them a special case. In other words, it's a move away from that idea, that to attack on the idea that actually the working class has a sort of a special role in terms of overturning and challenging the capitalist system. It's all this sort of plurality of resistances. Going on there to talk about the state and saying, the recodification of power relations, and further that no one can perfectly well conceive of revolutions which leave untouched the power of relations which form the basis for the functioning of the state. In other words, you can take on one set of power relations, but not necessarily actually take on the power relations of the state, and so on. And I think a lot of the ideas of post-Marxism are developed in dialogue with various forms of post-structuralist philosophy like this, and Foucault in particular. Okay, I'm going to look at sort of two broad examples while I've still got people in terms of post-Marxism. The first is a set of ideas around. Thank you. I'm going to go over a bit. The first set of ideas is around Tony Negri and Michael Haas. Their most important book is probably Empire, and Negri's ideas come out of a big revolt that takes place in Italy. You have the student revolt of 67-68, the strikes of 69, and this gives way as a prelude to a much bigger wave of workers' revolt, and also one that begins to challenge society a bit more generally. Think the Christian Democrats suffer a big defeat over divorce and so on. So the broader kind of social radicalization that goes on there. But despite this, 5 years later, Italian society is restabilized, partly through the role of the Italian Communist Party, through its historic compromise, plays a very kind of filthy role in holding back struggle and so on, and also the various kind of other forms of Marxism that were around. Often look to forms of Maoism in China and so on, and shortcuts to revolution, to the idea of having to actually win the majority of working class people, to the need for revolution. Negri and workerism kind of at that time focused on the direct conflict between capital and labor in the immediate process of production, and talked about the mass concept of the mass worker and so on. However, I think this leads to some quite big problems then, because if you're just focusing on that, the direct conflict, the immediate process of production, once there's changes in that immediate process of production, it throws into a kind of crisis the whole idea of the role of the working class and the shape of the working class. And I think within Negri, what there is a sort of a collapse of seeing the relations of production and the forces of production. So in other words, changes in the way perhaps the production process is organized, in other words, throws into crisis the whole question of the working class as a force for people like Negri. And he then talks about the socialized or the social worker, where he says the capitalist suppression of the form of value means the class antagonisms are displaced onto the social level. Class struggle does not disappear, it is rather transformed into all moments of everyday life. The daily life of the proletariat is posited as a whole against the domination of capital. In other words, it's no longer thinking about the strategic power of the working class in the process of production and so on. Rather, it's saying that, even if you're from a more marginalized group, students, the unemployed and so on, you basically have the same kind of strategic power as core sections of the working class. This develops then. This develops from the socialized worker to later on in Negri's work to talk of the multitude, which I'm going to talk about now. Talk about in a bit. Right. Negri's ideas, which probably people will most know about, is the questions of empire and multitude, and this kind of filters down often into a kind of common sense amongst some activists. So what is empire? It was posited as a new global form of sovereignty, which is sort of presided over by multinational corporations, international global institutions such as the IMF and the WTO, a system where kind of nation states have a sort of secondary importance, although they were first forced to acknowledge that, maybe the state was quite important in terms of the invasion of Iraq in the 2000s, but after they wrote that, although didn't shift too much. Empire isn't a territorial, rather it's power lies everywhere and nowhere. Immaterial labor is dominant, I'll explain what I mean by this, and empire tries to absorb the creativity of the multitude. The multitude the concept chimed with the kind of anti-capitalist movement of the 90s and 2000s. The multitude is basically anyone subject to the social domination of capital. It is broader than wage laborers employed by capital, and I think Negri and Hott counterpose this to the idea of the working class. And really what part of their argument is that immaterial labor, I'll explain this in 2 seconds, don't worry, has now become hegemonic over productive labor. And by immaterial labor, they sort of mean people who produce symbols, codes, texts, IT or media workers, for instance, or what they call affective labor, producing or manipulating emotions. And this includes, I don't know, flight attendants, fast food workers, and so on. And really, immaterial labor does not obey the same laws of motion of capitalism as Marx developed. In a nutshell, Marx argued the value of commodities, whether material goods or immaterial services, reflects the average labor time required to produce them. And they're saying this no longer holds. And you can see how that feeds into a set of kind of fairly common sense ideas sometimes, which are reflected is that, look, these sort of changes in capitalism mean that not all value is kind of produced by workers. I remember, Paul Mason, for instance, would argue these sort of things, that say if you take Amazon, right? Now we'll have various workers who've organized in Amazon, including striking against and speaking at Marxism. Now, there's an argument to say Amazon is based on derives its profit from prosumers. That you're a consumer, but actually by sort of, because you kind of reveal the preferences, what you need to buy in the future, essentially you're the kind of, in a way, the source of the value for Amazon. Well, I don't think it actually stacks up. Amazon brings together large amounts of capital and labor, of living and dead labor together in huge warehouses. And this is actually where the value is pumped out that Amazon gets their profits from. You think about a corporation like Google, for instance. This isn't just about, consumers on the internet and so on. In 2020, 80% of its profits, revenue, come from corporate advertising. In other words, capitalist firms pay it money to do the advertising, and therefore Google itself employs workers to provide that service, to capture a portion of that value and invest capital to do so. So it's not the idea that you have capitalism does revolutionize, the economy changes and so on, but saying that this means that the relations of production all have fundamentally changed, or we live in a weightless economy, I think is wrong. And it's the root of many of the kind of ideas of post-Marxist thinkers saying that we've gone beyond the questions of how of classical Marxism and its strategy. How am I doing for time? I've got 2 minutes. Jesus Christ. Okay, I'm going to probably go slightly over. I promise I'll okay, and that's kind of one form of post-Marxism. And I think perhaps people can begin to see, even if they are not familiar with Negri and so on, where some of those ideas feed into a common sense. Political implications of it, of autonomism. You have sort of a focus on, acts of subversion, which often takes the form of a network rather than a political organization based on parties or singular movements. An obsession on kind of prefigurative politics, the spaces that we create in some way can have to prefigure the sort of society, a different sort of society. There isn't a sort of, and that's a sort of alternative to a strategic clash with the actual centers of political power, and an emphasis on sort of process and consensus decision making, and also the idea of subversion by marginalized groups rather than talk of the working class and the importance of it. And I think people perhaps don't go around saying I've read Empire and Multitude and so on, but nonetheless I think those kind of ideas that are within it do filter down in these sorts of forms. I think there are other ways that other forms of post-Marxism as well, which I was going to talk a lot more about, but I've sort of whittled on here, which I will touch on just briefly now. There's also Leclerc and Chantal Mouffe, which we could sort of say is kind of a left reformist post-Marxism rather than a kind of autonomist Marxism. and they kind of argue for a left populist strategy. If you think about the kind of a concrete example, Podemos, often drew on those sort of ideas. But what they said was that Marxism is essentially class essentialist, that it was a kind of deterministic, and argued that there was the link between liberal democracy and the kind of socio-economic political system of capitalism was a contingent one. Rather, Marx talks about, in his critique of political economy, the idea that economics is not a crude kind of, deterministic relationship, but it limits and shapes politics and class forces and so on, their material interests at the base of society. They said this was far too deterministic. Really, it's about language, discourse, and so on, is how we construct reality. Language and identity are never fixed, and it can lead to the growth of different overlapping and competing identities which clash with one another, and therefore a unified revolutionary subject, the working class, is not possible. Now, I just want to say, Marxism doesn't say that, the working class is a sort of a homogeneous, ready-made revolutionary subject. It's something that has to be worked on. There's all sorts of divisions within the working class and so on. But it says that the potential power to do that. But really, I think, again, the Clown Move was sort of reacting against quite a deterministic sort of Marxism. But what does this mean? If you sort of say that the link between liberal democracy, the kind of political forms and so on, the state that we see, and capitalism is a contingent one, that actually then leads to a kind of a ruthless focus on forms of electoral politics as a kind of an important field of what they would call counter-hegemonic struggle, rather than the working class and so on. And you can see actually the dangers then with Podemos, when Podemos begins by denouncing the political elite, left populist language, as the caste. They end up in a government with them, and now end up actually being hammered for those sort of failures. So the problems of reformism are actually, once you say you want to use the present state, you end up, you either have to confront capital, or you end up making compromises like Podemos and Syriza did. And I think that's not incidental. That's linked to that set of ideas. And I'm going to be sold off here. So I'm just going to finish by saying a lot of those kind of ideas are framed from Le Clown Move, are framed by kind of appeal to Antonio Gramsci, who talks about hegemony. And hegemony is basically a variety of ways in which the ruling class, not just through the repressive apparatus of the state, but also through civil society, through ideology and so on, tries to maintain its rule. And Gramsci said that the working class had to, through the process of struggle, try and go from to break with those kind of dominant ideas, and actually through those struggles could seek to unify those different interests of oppressed groups around a core of workers' power, of workers' struggle, to actually build a counter-hegemony and take on the system. What Le Clown Move do, they take the idea of hegemony, having to construct a hegemony against the ruling class, but kind of de-link it from class analysis and class struggle, and really it just becomes a kind of different kind of modality of politics. And I think Gramsci wouldn't really recognize their kind of conception of hegemony. But nonetheless, I think actually that genuine kind of Gramscian approach is one that is still important, because when you look around the world today, that central question that we face is how can we change society, and also what kind of organization do we need, and what's the social force? And I think what Marxism provides is genuine kind of classical, non-deterministic Marxism, the tradition that we stand in, a view of how the working class still has the objective social power, how it's now also the majority, wage laborers are the majority within the world, and could transform society. And that means trying to link all those different kind of struggles that we see around a core of workers' power, and then directing that power as centers of capitalist power, including the state. That's a key question if you're in Sudan. How do you link the strategic power of the working class to the different oppressed groups and the poor? Whether you were in France, where you had that revolt started taking many, many different issues, But the question would have been, how do you try and link all those different struggles around a core of workers' power and then hurling that and directing that at the state? And therefore, I think we should engage with post-Marxism and take its ideas seriously. But actually, it is a challenge to that central idea. And I think Marxism offers a better way of analyzing the world and a better way of changing it as well.
Thank you, Tomáš. Thank you so much. So I'll give you a few minutes to talk to your neighbor, and then I'll call you back into the main room. Please raise your hand to make a contribution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, first of all, for the input. My name is Ramses from Marx 21 in Germany. And I also have a question with an international aspect to it, actually. So I think it's very clear that there are certain circumstances with a decline also of struggle and class struggle, how this post-structuralist ideology could develop and so on, with a decline also of the 68 movement and so on. I wanted to ask about a certain link I saw in different countries within that development. For example, the turf ideology in England, but also there's a certain similarity to the anti-German or anti-Deutsch development in Germany, or this anti-religious, anti-Muslim development with the new atheists in France, for example, where you have certain tendencies also within the left who are weaponizing a certain question of oppression. In Germany, it's the question of anti-Semitism against Palestine solidarity and so on, and are working towards a breakthrough also of bourgeois ideology within the left even. And my question is also how to struggle against that, because it's a huge dividing force, also taking more and more room in the left. And I think that we really have to severely fight to stay also the tribunes of the oppressed as revolutionary socialists. Thank you.
Thank you. The comrade over there, thank you.
Hello, comrade. I just wanted to, was thinking during the introduction about what's happening in France, because I'm coming from France. You know, these ideas of postmodernism, of fragmentation, atomization, and so on. In fact, they fit very well periods where there is no struggle, or periods where people are despaired, and so on. And suddenly, when there are some struggles on a mass scale, these ideas are not fitting the reality. The question, and why these discussions are very important, is that even if in the mass revolt, these ideas, this analysis doesn't fit it anymore, the experience of people. You know, the experience in France for months, where millions of people sharing the same objectives, the same situation, fighting for the same thing, making some connection with different questions and so on. But these ideas are still dominating, you know, and dominating the organization, the leadership, the trade union leadership, the main left organization, and even some, you know, so-called revolutionary currents and so on. And just to finish, if you see what's happening, now it's the second night, last night, that was the second night of mass riots spreading in France. And I can tell you that what happened for 4 months is going to change the way the riots are going to spread. And we have already first signals of some, not just young people in the suburbs fighting the police and rioting, but already some current, some activists organizing with the youth in the suburb to fight the police. That's the connection. That's why we need to fight these ideas of fragmentation, or not totality, and so on, to give a revolutionary future.
Thank you. The comrade in pink, with the pink t-shirt. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, it's somewhat ironic that it's actually called Post-Marxism, because like the word post would sort of suggest that it's sort of building on or sort of furthering Marxist thought, right? But sort of this scrutinization or even sort of outright dismissal that the emancipation of the working class is the act of the working class, it's almost like it's underpinning its own theoretical philosophy, right? And I think if you look around today, right, and you can see the mass strikes that are happening at the moment, the idea that there is no sort of revolutionary subject, I mean, is completely blown out of the water. And I think that we need to sort of reject the idea that like culture, that different cultural identities have superseded that of class, right? And the fact that I think that workers remain to be special, and I think that's very, very clear the past 2 years. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think the experience of left populism, the whole analysis developed by Mouffe and Laclau, is a particularly important one to look at if we want to demolish the ideas of post-Marxism, because this is now one form of post-Marxism that has left the circles of the academia and has actually been tested in the real world, especially through the experience of Podemos in the Spanish state with very negative results. I mean, I think Tomáš is absolutely right to say, that as Marxists, these are ideas that we don't simply want to smash, we want to actually engage with them in a creative way. Because the likes of Laclau and Mouffe actually started from a position where they are increasingly frustrated with the fact that Marxism is becoming, in many ways, a theory that is increasingly unable to speak to large numbers of people. So the starting point is how can we, the left, speak to the majority of working class people, and crucially, how can we win? The problem is that their rejection of Marxism as an economic deterministic idea is based not on the real ideas of Marxism, it's actually based on an Stalinist distortion of Marxism. The understanding in Marxism of what we would call the economic base of society and then the ideological and political superstructure and how the two interact is much more sophisticated than in the Stalinist version, which doesn't want to emphasize the role of the individual, the role of organization, because it was an ideology developed mostly to justify the rule of Stalin and other Stalinist leaders. And that leads to this decoupling of economics and politics. And it can lead to the conclusion, as it does in their case, that it is possible to retain liberal democracy as it exists in places like Britain, coexisting with an economic system that overcomes capitalism. So while they try to reject the whole framework of reform and revolution, in practice you end up with a full circle leading to incredibly reformist conclusions. The idea that just by working within the system, it is possible to overcome the exploitation and the oppression that exist without altering the fundamental structure of society. There's no understanding of the role of the working class, there's no understanding of how to come up with the question of the state, and you can see in the case of Podemos, but also in the cases of Syriza and many other projects that Mouffe in particular celebrated as examples of left-wing populism, the failure of that. My final point is that as Marxists, if we want to challenge the ideas of post-Marxism and post-modernism, it's important we do that through theory. We also have to challenge them in practice. We have to show in practice that by basing ourselves on the ideas of Marxism, it is possible to lead action and take struggles forward more effectively and more successfully than based on the ideas of post-Marxism.
Thank you. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, this follows on from what the previous speaker said, because I think we have to understand that post-Marxism is a price we pay for bad Marxism. In the sense both that if you look at the role of Stalinism, Stalinism was a key force in stifling the liberatory potential that came out of 1968 and the big rebellions that happened in the early 1970s. It helped to pave the way for the long retreat from class and all the ideas of post-Marxism that have flourished on that basis. And combined with that political role of Stalinism, you have the ideological counterpart, this crude, reductionist, determinist form of Marxism, which is infinitely worse than most forms of post-Marxism. And you can understand why these ideas have appeal within that context. And I think part of our answer to that, theoretically, has to be to go back to what a classical Marxism can do. Classical Marxism had no trouble analysing difference, analysing oppression. Look at Marx's writings. Central to Marx's writings in the 1860s is the question of the emancipation of the slaves in America during the American Civil War, the liberation of Poland from national oppression. The question of women's liberation runs through Marx and Engels' writings. The question of anti-colonial struggle in Ireland and India features in that writings. Marx wasn't ignorant of these forms of difference and forms of oppression, but he connected them to the totalizing nature of capital and the way that as capitalism spread, it would reproduce these relations of exploitation that gave a central role to workers in liberating humanity from these forms of oppression. Now, what's that mean politically? Tomáš has already alluded to one of the points I wanted to make, which is that you can't talk about a Marxism, a living Marxist tradition that ignores the question of transliberation today. These crude forms of Marxism, classism and so on, that say this isn't an issue for us, are completely wrong. We have to take up these issues of oppression and connect them to the broader struggle for worker self-emancipation. Even sharper examples one Denis gave. Every socialist worth their salt in France understands they have to build the strike movement. Do you also say, well, now we have to go to the suburbs of Paris and stand shoulder to shoulder with black and Arab youth fighting the police and connect that to a strike movement? If you don't do that, you're not a serious Marxist. And that's the real Marxist tradition that we have to defend and build.
Thank you.
Hi. It was also to react to the French comrades about the fact that in France millions of people went in protests. It was like something huge, something personally I had never seen before. Yet these ideas are still there. I think the answer could be, one of the answers of course, could be that all of these millions of people still didn't act as workers. Because what's important too, I think, is that you can be, 10,000 in a protest, but still don't act the way only the working class can. That is, fight for the power of our class. Because, it's like, if you think about students, for example, there are a lot of students that actually work, that are actually employed outside of uni. There are also a lot of students that don't work. Can these students act as workers? And by that I mean, can they actually have the power of the working class of fighting against their boss? Well, no, because they don't have a boss. Of course, they can fight for better conditions, like of studying. They can fight for cheaper rent and other things like that, and that's important. But I think what we need to understand is that it's important to not only to be a lot of workers at the same place, but to make sure that all these workers act the way only someone from the working class can.
Thank you. The comrade in the white t-shirt, thank you.
Hi. I want to ask about the immaterial labor and rise of immaterial labor. So a lot of the movement from the working class that can happen based on the idea that workers are needed, and with the rise of material labor, more and more workers aren't particularly needed, and therefore they don't have this power. If they stop working, no one particularly cares. And their position in the system kind of depends on the system working as it is. So if they do protest, they're actually kind of shooting themselves in the knee. So, my question is, what do you think about this? And the second one is, you said that classical Marxism looks at the problem through the economic lens predominantly, and, you didn't, so I got it wrong. Okay.
Thank you. The comrade in the front here with the, thank you.
Yeah, you talked about Negri and Hart and Empire. And of course, Negri was actually part of the movement coming out of '68 and the hot autumn in Italy. But it was also a movement that led to whole numbers of groups like Avanguardia Operaia and Lotto Continua, all of which are, very much autonomous-based political organisations, which completely collapsed by the end of the 70s. And you saw the absolute dead end of, the Red Brigade, the kidnapping of Aldo Moro, and what subsequently followed in terms of the years of lead in Italy, and sort of general sense of repression and absolute sort of defeat of the working class. Of course, Negri himself, I think, spent quite a few years in Italian prisons, having been deported back to France. But also, I think, and even more tragically, we've just seen the same thing happen again in Italy in the last 20 years. With, if you think back to the early 2000s, I remember being old, going to the the Forum in Florence in 2002, and it was covered in Democrazia Proletaria, sort of leading a very strong resistance movement, sort of mass demonstration against the war, and a sort of rising movement. But then what we've seen since is that sort of collapse into sort of the so-called technicist government of Prodi, and then the ghastliness of the late lamented Berlusconi, and so on and so forth. And of course, what's it actually culminated in is the the absolute shocking horror, and Geraldine would know a lot more about this than I do, of the Prime Minister of Italy now being Giorgia Meloni in the Fratelli d'Italia. I mean, and I think it's like, what does this tell us about autonomism? And again, what kind of hopes are there in Italy for something that actually changes direction? Have people actually learnt from that?
Thank you. The comrade in the black T-shirt, and then thank you. Yes, thank you.
Hi, comrades. I wanted to come back on the speaker's point. He touched a little. Well, first of all, first time being introduced to sort of post-Marxist ideas, so I'm kind of going off the fly here a bit, so do correct me if I'm wrong. But the speaker spoke a little bit about post-Marxism and immaterial labour, and it's my understanding that Marx, though did look at dead labour, didn't perhaps look at it as much, because we don't have quite as much of it then as we do today. But that has changed. Now, I'm a cybersecurity analyst, right? You could class my labour as immaterial labour, but I would disagree with that completely from a Marxist analysis point of view, because as much as machines bring to me cases I need to defend networks, which is what I do, I defend networks, and it's the process of defending that network that is my wage product, so to speak. If I don't turn up to that computer, the computer can't defend itself. It just can't. It needs me. And that's where I think that a Marxist analysis of modern ideas is still useful, is you still need the working class. You could then argue about our ideas of artificial intelligence, and which I do actually use a lot in my work. It's very useful, but that's great up until it doesn't work anymore, and then you need a worker to go and fix it. So you still end up with the same problem in that eventually it just loops around and round. You need a job for that job, for that job, for that job. And so we come back to Marx, where you still need the worker at the forefront of it, and thus we still, according to the methodological analysis using Marxism, have that power. And all we need to change is looking at, under that lens, I suppose, is how we use our modern world and how we look at that from a Marxist point of view, because it's the world that's not Marx. But yeah, I'll just leave it there.
Thank you. Yes, the comrade there, and you're going to be the last contribution. Thank you.
Thank you. So I had kind of a question about post-structuralism. Their belief is that power is this very diffuse force that's all over the place and everywhere, but I'm going to use my own home, the hellscape that is the United States, to kind of talk about, they also talk about these supranational organizations that exist, and those organizations, a lot of the more powerful countries have ceded that power to those organizations and taken it from less powerful countries. But in the US, what we've seen happening is the UN, for instance, takes some power from the US. So the US takes power from the states, and then the states take power from local councils. And it just keeps pulling power more and more away from the people. So I guess I'm struggling to kind of understand how they reconcile that.
Thank you. And thank you everybody for the great discussion and the contributions, and apologies for the people that wanted to contribute, but I don't have time to call. Before calling the speaker to sum up, I have an announcement, which is the opening rally tonight, which kicks off at 7 p.m. The panel is fantastic. We are going to have many activists, campaigners. Chris Smalls is one of them, who has unionized Amazon workers in the US, and many others. So please come. And it's at Friends Meeting House, which is in Houston Road, and it's about 5-10 minutes walk. Thank you, and apologies again for the people that wanted to contribute, but there is going to be plenty of time in these 4 days to have plenty of conversations. I'll ask Tomáš to sum up. Thank you.
Well, thanks for all the contributions. I'll try and come back on it in 2 broad swoops and not just put in everything that I wanted to get into the first half and didn't manage to do. Okay, the first one is just about different forms of Marxism, because I think this is an important question. When I said, how would you define Marxism? I said, it's the theory and practice of working class self-emancipation. That is not what I was taught when I was growing up. That is not what the majority of people think of when they think of Marxism. Perhaps it's as one of the states associated with it, whether that's the former Soviet Union, from the former Czechoslovakia, or China, or Cuba, or some regime like that. Perhaps it's a focus on economics and an economic sort of determinist view of history, rather than the sort of much richer understanding that I think Marxism provides. And I think those are the kind of dominant views of it. And the reason for that, I think, is definitely because of the hegemony that Stalinism had within large parts of the left and the working class movement throughout the post-war period. And I think even though many people broke with that, many of them didn't actually sort of break with it and go back to classical Marxism. They looked to other forms of socialism from above, other forms of Marxism that weren't based on working class self-emancipation. And therefore you can understand why post-Marxism arises. And I think that context is incredibly important, because it's not just these people broke with a genuine revolutionary kind of Marxist sort of tradition. They were actually reacting against some of the very real limits of 1968 and the failures of it, and wanted to come up with solutions. Not solutions that I agree with or I think are the right way forward, but nonetheless that's the sort of context. And I think part of our job, if you're a revolutionary socialist, is to engage with people and engage in movements who might have those sort of ideas, but try and win people to the idea of the self-emancipation of the working class. That look, if you're serious about changing society, so are we, but actually you have to look to a social force which is capable of doing that. And that's not the multitude, it's not a left reformist project, it's the working class through the course of revolution setting up its own democratic institutions which rival the capitalist state, and then taking power from the bottom up. And you have to do that through argument, but also when you think of differences of strategy on the left, how are they really settled? It's through practice. Many people after the Russian Revolution looked towards the Bolsheviks in Russia as the way forward, because they had briefly had a successful socialist revolution. So I don't think we're just going to win people just by argument and so on. That's important. It's also about trying to enact in practice a different sort of strategy, a strategy for going forward. Just want to deal with the question. A couple of people mentioned immaterial labor, and I think that's one of the sort of challenges that comes up from post-Marxism, which is to say, look, capitalism has changed from when Marx was writing, and therefore different forms of labor. His ideas don't really apply to what's taking place today. And again, I think that comes from a caricature of what the working class is, and often a Stalinist caricature of what the working class is supposed to be. I mean, this is Marx writing in Volume 1 of Capital. Capitalist production is not merely the production of commodities, it is, by its very essence, the production of surplus value. If we take, as an example, from the sphere, outside the sphere of material production, a schoolmaster is a productive worker when, in addition to the laboring the heads of the pupils, he works himself into the ground to enrich the owner of the school, its private school. That the latter has laid out his capital is in a teaching factory instead of a sausage factory makes no difference to this relation. So in other words, talking, when it comes to knowledge-based economy and all these kind of concepts, this is not something that Marx was unaware of. It's about the production of surplus value. People go to work and they don't get back the full value of what they're creating wages, and that's surplus value, which lays the basis of capitalist profit. And therefore, it's not just about a particular type of worker, which I think people can fetishize. It's about that social, that relation of exploitation, those relations of production. Even if you don't, let's take another example. If you don't directly, produce profit, say you're a public sector worker, okay? Well, if you're a school worker and you go on strike, you still have a massive economic impact because other people can't send their children to school, and therefore, there again, you still have a social power, even if you're not going into a factory or running the trains and these sort of things. So I think we need a much richer understanding of what the working class is, and going back to a Marxist analysis of that, rather than seeing it as an identity, or the working class is based on culture and these sort of things. And Marxism, a real genuine Marxism, provides us with the tools to do that. Then just lastly, well, what's a genuine Marxist approach to some of the questions which some of the speakers have, to the way forward today, which some of the speakers have spoke about and alluded to? Well, look, first of all, I think you can see in the system how questions of oppression have become big mobilizers, whether that's Black Lives Matter, whether that's Me Too, whether that's the fight for trans and non-binary liberation. And I think right across the board on those questions, there's been a radicalization that's taking place. And our job as revolutionary socialists is to, first of all, stand with people. Lenin talks about revolutionaries having to be tribunes of the oppressed, right? But then also to try and argue for and fight for a strategy which says those oppressions are rooted within the system, and therefore we have to try and look towards the working class as a force, as a social force, that could take on that system and begin to uproot oppression within society. Now, that's not based on sort of finger wagging. We're not going to go on Trans Pride next week and say, you need to look to the working class, why aren't you doing this? So what we're doing, we're organizing a huge trade union bloc, taking the argument into workplaces all over London about why workers should support trans rights, trying to prove in practice why questions of oppression are class issues. Because if the working class is divided on the basis of oppression, we'll never be in a strong enough unified position to give the poshos a kicking, right? Basically. So, it's part of winning that argument. And so you can see how a genuine Marxist approach actually gives us the tools to go forward. And then I'll be told to stop again, so rightly. So I'll just finish on this. Again, I think those kind of questions about how do you try and link together those different fights around a core, around a spine of working class power are crucial, whether you're in Britain, whether you're in France, whether you're in Sudan. And I think the Marxist kind of approach is to say we're not indifferent at all to those different sort of struggles, but in order to win, the social force that can do that is the working class, and therefore you have to try and raise all those kind of political issues within the working class movement, but also try and prove in practice that it's a social force within the other movements and so on the side. And that then raises the question of revolutionary organization. I alluded to a skepticism towards the idea of a revolutionary party amongst post-Marxist thinkers. What's a revolutionary party fundamentally? It's not about separating ourselves off and saying, you know, we're better than other people, we understand, the working class movement doesn't understand, and so on, or a minority acting on behalf of other people. Crucially, it's recognizing that within the working class, you know, its potential to be a revolutionary subject, but there are uneven ideas within the working class. And that's because of the, you know, people's ideas under capitalism are formed both through basically accepting that capitalism is natural, but also thinking they can win reforms within the system. That kind of conforms to people's experience. And what we want to do is to group together all those people who want to tear the head off the system, who want to get rid of it, not to separate them off, but to be part of those different struggles that can actually then seek to argue for revolutionary politics within the working class. And that's a key challenge, because, you know, the scale of crisis we face means that we have to get rid of the system. Think about the climate crisis and so on. We understand that there's a potential social force that could do it, but to go from potential to actuality takes organization, and that takes revolutionary organization, and that's what we're trying to build in the SWP.